Hello and welcome to Histocrat at Night. Tonight, we're traveling back over 2,000 years to ancient Africa to uncover one of history's most incredible and inspiring stories. A story that completely challenges everything you thought you knew about Rome's invincibility and dominance. We're talking about Amanirenas, the legendary one-eyed warrior queen who did something that seemed almost impossible in her time. She made the mighty Roman Empire back down, retreat, and negotiate peace on her terms. Picture this scene in your mind. It's the 1st century BCE, around 24 BCE to be specific, and the Mediterranean world is absolutely dominated by one superpower that seems unstoppable: Rome. They've conquered the fierce tribes of Gaul in modern France. They've taken control of sophisticated Greece and absorbed its culture. And, most recently, they've completely absorbed Egypt after the dramatic death of the famous Cleopatra. Rome seems like an unstoppable juggernaut, an empire that swallows entire kingdoms and civilizations whole without even breaking a sweat. Their legions are legendary. Their generals are brilliant, and their determination to expand seems limitless. But south of Egypt, in the region that's now modern Sudan, there's a kingdom that Rome is about to seriously, catastrophically underestimate. That kingdom is Kush, with its magnificent capital city at Meroe, and under the leadership of an extraordinary woman named Amanirenas. It's about to teach Rome a lesson about limits, about resistance, and about the price of underestimating your opponents. This is a story about courage and strategy, about warfare and diplomacy, and ultimately about how a determined leader can defend her people's freedom against overwhelming odds. Now, before we dive into the incredible conflict between Amanirenas and Rome, we need to understand what Kush actually was, because this wasn't some minor backwater kingdom that just got lucky. Kush was a major African power with an absolutely fascinating and rich history stretching back over 1,000 years. While most people today know about Egypt's famous pyramids, the Great Pyramid of Giza, and all those iconic structures, what fewer people realize is that Kush actually built more pyramids than Egypt did. That's not an exaggeration or nationalist propaganda. It's simply a historical fact. The Kushites built over 200 pyramids, and you can still see them standing today in the Sudanese desert, if you're fortunate enough to visit. These weren't just cheap copies of Egyptian architecture either. Kushite pyramids were distinctly different: steep-sided, elegant, smaller but more numerous than Egyptian pyramids. They reflected a civilization with its own aesthetic values, its own engineering traditions, its own cultural identity that was related to Egypt but definitely not identical to it. The kingdom controlled vast gold mines that made them fabulously wealthy, and gold meant power in the ancient world. They had sophisticated iron production technology that gave them military and economic advantages. They dominated the lucrative ivory trade routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean world and beyond. Kush wasn't just wealthy and powerful, it was cultured and sophisticated. Their pyramids and temples testified to advanced architectural knowledge. They developed their own writing system called Meroitic script, which sadly hasn't been fully deciphered yet, though scholars continue working on it. They created distinctive art and sculpture that shows influences from Egypt, from Africa, and from their own unique traditions. They had complex religious beliefs, sophisticated political institutions, and a merchant class that conducted trade across vast distances. This was a civilization operating at the highest levels of ancient achievement. But what made Kush truly unique? What really set them apart from almost every other civilization in the ancient world was their remarkable and progressive tradition of female rulers. Think about the contrast here. In Rome, which considered itself the height of civilization, women had virtually no legal rights. They couldn't vote in elections, they couldn't own property independently of their fathers or husbands, they couldn't hold any political office whatsoever, they couldn't represent themselves in legal proceedings. Roman women were essentially the property of the men in their families, with their roles limited to the domestic sphere. The idea of a woman commanding armies or making political decisions would have seemed absolutely absurd to most Romans. But in Kush, women could become Kandake, a title that's sometimes written as Candace in ancient sources, which meant queen or queen mother, and wield supreme political and military power. And this wasn't just ceremonial or symbolic power, the way some queens in other cultures might have titles but no real authority. These were women who commanded armies in battle, who conducted high-level diplomatic negotiations with other powers, who made strategic decisions about war and peace, who ruled their kingdom with absolute sovereign authority. The Kandake tradition was institutionalized in Kushite culture. It was a recognized, respected path to power that was specifically available to women. Amanirenas was one such Kandake, and she came to power around 40 BCE during a time of tremendous upheaval and change in the ancient world. The old Hellenistic kingdoms that had dominated the eastern Mediterranean since Alexander the Great were being absorbed one by one into the growing Roman Empire. It was a time when the world order was being fundamentally reshaped, when ancient powers were falling and new ones rising. Ancient sources, particularly the Greek geographer Strabo, describe Amanirenas as a formidable and impressive figure, a woman who'd been trained in the arts of warfare and statecraft from her youth, who understood both military strategy and political maneuvering, who was respected and even feared by those who encountered her. But what really came to define Amanirenas, what made her not just a ruler, but a legend that echoes down through over 2,000 years of history, wasn't just her position or her training or her personal qualities. It was what happened when Rome, flush with its conquest of Egypt and feeling practically invincible, decided to push its luck too far south and challenge Kushite independence. You see, the trigger for everything that followed was the death of Cleopatra VII of Egypt in 30 BCE. Cleopatra's death, the famous story of the asp, the suicide, the tragedy, marked the end of Egyptian independence after 3,000 years. Egypt, which had been ruled by the Ptolemaic dynasty, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, suddenly became a Roman province. The last independent Hellenistic kingdom had fallen, and Rome now controlled one of the richest, most strategically important regions in the world. And suddenly, dramatically, Kush had a new neighbor to the north, and this neighbor had very different ideas about how international relations should work in the region. Roman officials, flush with their relatively easy conquest of Egypt and feeling practically invincible after decades of successful expansion across 3 continents, started looking south toward Kush with calculating eyes. They saw the wealth, those famous gold mines, those valuable trade routes, those resources that could enrich Rome, and they wanted a piece of it. They saw a kingdom that wasn't part of the Roman system, and that offended their sense that all civilized lands should acknowledge Roman superiority. So they did what Rome typically did when they wanted something from a neighboring power. They sent demands. Roman officials demanded that Kush pay tribute to Rome, that they acknowledge Roman superiority and dominance, that they accept that their kingdom existed only at Rome's pleasure and could continue only with Roman approval. These weren't polite requests or friendly suggestions. These were demands backed by the implicit threat of Roman military force. Now, we need to understand what tribute meant in the ancient world, because it wasn't just about money or goods, though that was certainly part of it. Tribute was fundamentally about power relationships and political submission. When one kingdom paid tribute to another, it was a public, formal acknowledgement of inferiority. It was saying, "You are greater than us. We serve at your pleasure. Our sovereignty is conditional rather than absolute. We exist because you permit us to exist." It was deeply humiliating, and it established a clear hierarchy where the tribute-paying kingdom was subordinate to the tribute-receiving power. For Amanirenas and the proud people of Kush, who'd maintained their fierce independence for over 1,000 years, who'd never bowed to any foreign power, who considered themselves equals to Egypt and certainly not inferiors to some upstart Mediterranean empire, this demand was completely and utterly unacceptable. Kush had its own ancient traditions, its own proud history, its own sense of sovereignty and dignity. The idea of paying tribute to Rome, of acknowledging Roman superiority, of accepting subordinate status. It was insulting, it was intolerable, and Amanirenas had no intention of accepting it. The Roman officials in Egypt, comfortable in their garrison posts along the Nile, probably thought enforcing these demands would be relatively easy. They'd just conquered Egypt without too much trouble, after all. Cleopatra's forces had been defeated at the Battle of Actium, and the transition to Roman rule had been accomplished fairly smoothly. What could this southern kingdom, this African power that most Romans had barely heard of, possibly do against the legendary might of Roman legions? They were confident, perhaps even arrogant, assuming that Kush would quickly fall in line like so many other kingdoms had when confronted with Roman power. They were about to discover just how catastrophically wrong they were, and just how dangerous it is to underestimate a determined, strategically brilliant Kandake, who had no intention of letting her kingdom become a Roman tributary state. Amanirenas was watching the situation very carefully, with the calculating eye of an experienced strategist. She could see Roman forces consolidating their control over Egypt, establishing garrisons at key points, beginning to reorganize Egyptian administration under Roman control, flexing their military muscle and getting comfortable in their new province. But she also saw something else, something that Roman commanders had missed, an opportunity. The Roman governor of Egypt, Gaius Petronius, was dealing with various administrative challenges that come with absorbing a new province. He was managing the transition of power, dealing with potential resistance from Egyptian nobles who weren't happy about foreign rule, establishing tax collection systems, and dealing with various military concerns in different parts of Egypt. His forces, while formidable and well-trained, were stretched somewhat thin across this newly conquered, vast territory. Not dangerously thin, perhaps, but thin enough that they weren't as concentrated and ready as they might have been. And Amanirenas, with the kind of strategic mind and boldness that would define her entire reign and make her legendary, made a decision that would shock Rome to its very core. She wouldn't wait for Rome to attack Kush. She wouldn't sit passively and let Rome choose the time and place of conflict. Instead, she would seize the initiative, she would strike first, and she would strike hard before Rome was fully prepared. In 24 BCE, Amanirenas did something that Roman commanders never saw coming, something that violated their assumptions about how barbarian kingdoms would behave when confronted with Roman power. She personally led a massive army. Ancient sources claim over 30,000 warriors, though we should always take ancient numbers with some caution, as they were often exaggerated, in a lightning-fast offensive strike north across the border into Roman-controlled Egypt. This wasn't a minor border raid or some exploratory skirmish to test Roman defenses. This was a full-scale, carefully planned military invasion with clear strategic objectives and the full commitment of Kushite military power. Her primary targets were the cities of Syene, which is modern-day Aswan in southern Egypt, and the important Roman military garrison stationed at nearby Elephantine Island in the middle of the Nile River. These were significant Roman positions, fortified points that Rome considered absolutely secure, keystones of their control over southern Egypt. The Romans had garrisoned them with professional soldiers, built fortifications, and assumed these positions would deter any aggression from the south while serving as bases for potential Roman expansion further south into Kush, if that became desirable. The Kushite attack was devastating, brilliantly executed, and completely overwhelmed the Roman defenses. Amanirenas' forces, fighting with the fury and motivation of people defending their independence and freedom, with the skill of well-trained warriors who'd prepared carefully for this operation, and with the advantage of surprise that came from attacking before Rome expected any resistance, simply smashed through Roman positions. The Roman garrisons, caught completely off guard by the speed and ferocity of the attack, by the numbers and determination of the Kushite forces, found themselves unable to mount an effective defense. Within a remarkably short period of time, probably just days, these important Roman military positions had fallen to Kushite forces. Roman soldiers were killed or captured, Roman fortifications were seized, and suddenly, shockingly, Rome had lost control of a significant chunk of southern Egypt to an enemy they'd barely considered a serious threat. The news that some African kingdom had actually successfully attacked Roman territory and captured Roman positions would have seemed almost unbelievable to people in Rome when they first heard it. But what happened next is what really shows Amanirenas' sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare, symbolic politics, and the importance of sending powerful messages that go beyond mere military victory. During the capture of Syene and Elephantine, her forces found statues of Emperor Augustus Caesar, the most powerful man in the known world at that time, the emperor who'd defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra at Actium, who'd ended the Roman civil wars, who'd made himself master of the entire Mediterranean world, and was busy transforming the Roman Republic into an empire centered on his personal authority. These statues weren't just art or decoration in the ancient world. They were much more significant than that. Imperial statues represented the emperor's presence and authority. They were physical manifestations of imperial power, symbols that proclaimed, "Rome rules here, and Augustus is Rome's master." Every person who saw these statues was supposed to be reminded of Roman power and imperial authority. They were propaganda in bronze and stone, constant reminders of who was in charge. And what did Amanirenas' forces do with these statues? They systematically destroyed them, smashing them to pieces, showing their absolute contempt for Roman claims of superiority. But they did something even more significant. They carefully removed the bronze head from one particular statue of Augustus, a beautifully crafted portrait head, and they brought it back to Kush as a war trophy, as physical evidence of their victory over Rome. This might just seem like looting or vandalism to modern eyes, but in the ancient world, this was something much more significant and threatening. By taking Augustus's head, by removing it from Roman territory and carrying it off to Kush as a trophy of war, Amanirenas was making an incredibly bold, even shocking political and symbolic statement. She was essentially declaring to Rome and to the world, "We don't recognize your authority over us. We don't fear your power. We don't accept your claims of superiority. We've literally taken your emperor's head. We've seized the symbol of your authority, and we're keeping it as proof that we can defy you successfully." This bronze head, and we'll come back to its absolutely fascinating ultimate fate later in the story, because it's one of the most dramatic elements of this entire tale, became a powerful symbol of something that Rome very, very rarely experienced. genuine humiliation at the hands of an enemy they'd completely underestimated. It was a slap in the face to Roman pride, to Roman dignity, to Rome's carefully cultivated image of invincibility. And that image mattered enormously to Rome. Their entire imperial system depended partly on the perception that resistance was futile, that Rome always won in the end, that challenging Roman power was suicide. It's hard to overstate how shocking this news would have been when it reached Rome itself, traveling up from Egypt through the Mediterranean. Here was some African queen, some barbarian ruler from a kingdom most Romans had barely heard of, who'd not only attacked Roman territory, but had actually succeeded in capturing Roman positions and desecrating the emperor's image. It violated every Roman assumption about their own superiority and the inevitable submission of other peoples to Roman power. When Augustus himself heard about the attack, when he learned that Kushite forces had invaded Roman Egypt, captured important positions, and stolen his statues, he was reportedly absolutely furious. And we need to understand why this made him so angry. Augustus had spent years, decades really, carefully cultivating his public image as the bringer of peace and order to the Roman world. After years of devastating civil wars that had torn the Roman Republic apart, he'd presented himself as the man who ended the chaos, who brought stability and prosperity, who made Rome strong and secure. The title Augustus itself, which the Senate had granted him, meant something like revered one or majestic one. It carried connotations of religious authority and dignity. He'd closed the Temple of Janus in Rome, a symbolic act that meant Rome was at peace with no ongoing wars. He'd commissioned art and literature celebrating the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, that his rule had supposedly brought to the world. And now, some African queen was directly challenging that entire, carefully constructed image, making Rome look weak and vulnerable, proving that Rome's borders weren't secure and its power wasn't unchallengeable. Augustus's response was swift, decisive, and overwhelming. Exactly what you'd expect from a wounded empire whose pride had been hurt and whose authority had been challenged. He sent urgent orders to Petronius, the Roman governor in Egypt. Crush this rebellion immediately and decisively. Reclaim Roman honor and territory. Restore Roman authority in the region, and teach these Kushites what happens when you dare to challenge Rome. Show them the full, devastating might of Roman military power. Make an example of them that will discourage any other kingdoms or peoples from getting similar ideas about resisting Roman demands. Petronius, who was an experienced and capable Roman commander who'd seen service in multiple campaigns, gathered his available forces and began preparing for a major military campaign. He assembled several thousand legionaries. These were professional Roman soldiers, not temporary militia or conscripts, but career military men who'd signed up for 25-year terms of service and had been trained to an incredible standard of discipline and capability. These were soldiers who'd participated in conquests across 3 continents, who'd fought Gauls and Germans and Eastern peoples, who wore sophisticated armor and wielded highly effective weapons, who could construct fortified camps every single night on campaign, who moved in disciplined formations that could adapt to different enemies and terrain. The Roman military system was, quite simply, the most effective military machine the ancient world had yet produced. Their equipment was standardized and constantly improved based on experience. Their training was intensive and ongoing. Their logistics were sophisticated, with well-organized supply systems that could support armies far from home. Their tactics were flexible and battle-tested. Their engineering capabilities allowed them to build bridges, siege equipment, fortifications, and roads wherever they campaigned. And their discipline was legendary. Roman soldiers followed orders, maintained formation under pressure, and didn't break even in difficult circumstances. Against this formidable military machine, what did Kush have? Different advantages. Advantages that Amanirenas would exploit brilliantly throughout the coming conflict. The Kushites were fighting on their home territory, in landscapes and climates they'd known since childhood. Every hill, every water source, every seasonal weather pattern. They knew it all intimately in ways that foreign invaders never could. They had skilled Nubian archers who were absolutely legendary throughout the ancient world for their accuracy, for the power of their bows, for their ability to shoot from horseback or camelback, for their effectiveness in battle. Ancient sources from various civilizations mention Nubian archers with respect and even fear. They had mobile cavalry units mounted on horses and camels that could move quickly across desert terrain, that could strike fast and fade away before heavy infantry could respond, that could harass enemy supply lines and make occupation of territory incredibly difficult. They had intimate knowledge of desert survival, where to find water, how to move in extreme heat, how to navigate by stars and landmarks, how to avoid the worst of the day's heat and travel at dawn and dusk. They had supply lines that were short and secure, while any Roman supply line would stretch hundreds of miles back to Egypt through increasingly hostile territory. And most importantly, most powerfully, they had something that can't be measured in weapons or armor or numbers. They had a leader who'd already proven she wasn't afraid of Rome, who'd struck first and drawn blood, who'd humiliated the mighty empire and seized territory from it. And they had warriors who believed in her absolutely, who trusted her judgment, who were fighting for their homes and families and freedom, who knew what Roman conquest would mean: subjugation, tribute, loss of independence, foreign rule. That kind of motivation, that kind of determination, is worth more than any amount of sophisticated equipment or training. The war that followed wasn't a single decisive battle where everything was settled in one afternoon of fighting. Instead, it was a grinding series of engagements, skirmishes, sieges, and maneuvers as Petronius methodically and relentlessly pushed south into Kushite territory. Roman military doctrine emphasized careful, systematic conquest rather than reckless charges. Secure your supply lines, build fortified positions, advance steadily, consolidate gains, don't overextend. These were the principles that had won Rome an empire, and Petronius followed them carefully. His forces first moved to recapture Syene and Elephantine Island, re-establishing Roman control over the immediate border region that Amanirenas had seized in her initial offensive. This probably involved some fighting, though our sources don't give us detailed accounts of these engagements. But the Romans, with their superior siege equipment and their disciplined assault tactics, were able to retake these positions, probably at some cost in casualties, but successfully. Roman authority over southern Egypt was restored, and now Petronius faced a choice: stop there and consolidate, or push forward into Kush itself to punish them for their aggression. Petronius chose to push forward. He'd been ordered to make an example of Kush, to teach them a lesson about challenging Rome, and he intended to do exactly that. So Roman forces continued advancing southward, deeper into Kushite territory than any Roman army had ventured before, following the Nile south into regions that were increasingly alien to Mediterranean soldiers. The climate grew hotter, the landscape more barren, the conditions more challenging. But the legions marched on with their characteristic discipline and determination. Eventually, after weeks of marching and campaigning, Roman forces reached the ancient city of Napata, one of Kush's most historically significant and spiritually important sites. Napata wasn't the current capital. That was Meroe, further south and more secure. But Napata was the ancient seat of Kushite kings, the city where the kingdom had been centered centuries earlier, a major religious center with sacred temples and monuments, a place of tremendous spiritual and cultural significance to the Kushite people. In many ways, Napata was the heart and soul of Kushite civilization, the city that represented their ancient traditions and their connection to their past. Petronius's forces attacked Napata with the full fury and overwhelming power of Roman military might. The city, which may not have been as heavily fortified as it had been in earlier eras when it was the capital, eventually fell to the Roman assault after what was probably a fierce battle. Roman soldiers poured into the city, and then they did what Roman forces typically did to cities that had dared to resist them, to cities in kingdoms that had challenged Roman authority. They destroyed it systematically and brutally. They burned temples that had stood for centuries, sacred buildings where Kushites had worshipped their gods for generations. They smashed monuments and statues, destroying physical symbols of Kushite culture and history. They razed buildings, turning homes and palaces into ruins. The destruction was deliberate and thorough. This wasn't just about military conquest. This was about sending a message, about breaking the enemy's will to resist, about demonstrating that challenging Rome had terrible consequences. It was brutal, it was ruthless, and it was very much in keeping with Roman practice when dealing with rebellious peoples. For Amanirenas, receiving news of Napata's destruction must have been absolutely devastating on multiple levels. This wasn't just a military setback or the loss of a city. This was the destruction of sacred spaces, the desecration of temples, the burning of a city that represented the ancient heart of Kushite civilization. The emotional and psychological impact would have been enormous. Many leaders facing such a blow, facing the destruction of such a symbolically important city, would have been driven by emotion and pride to make desperate decisions. But here's where Amanirenas showed the kind of strategic brilliance and disciplined thinking that separated truly great leaders from merely brave ones. She could have ordered her army to make a desperate, emotionally driven last stand at Napata, throwing everything into a futile defense of the sacred city, sacrificing her forces in a doomed attempt to prevent its capture. Many leaders throughout history, driven by pride or emotion, or a sense that some symbolic positions must be held at all costs, have made exactly that kind of decision, and usually it ended in disaster. But Amanirenas understood something crucial about warfare that many commanders miss. Sometimes the smart play, the strategically correct decision, is to give ground, to accept temporary losses, to preserve your forces for future fighting. She understood that cities can be rebuilt, that what really mattered was preserving her army's ability to keep fighting, that losing Napata was painful, but losing her entire military force would be fatal to Kushite independence. She made the hard, disciplined choice that strategic thinking demanded, rather than the emotionally satisfying but strategically disastrous choice that pride might have suggested. Rather than sacrificing her army in a doomed defense of Napata, she ordered a strategic withdrawal. She pulled her forces back southward, away from the advancing Romans, deeper into the desert regions and more remote areas where Kushite forces would have every possible advantage, and where Roman legions, used to Mediterranean climates and more conventional warfare, would struggle tremendously. She was implementing a strategy that we might today call trading space for time, or strategic depth, deliberately giving up territory to preserve military capability, drawing the enemy further from their supply bases, into terrain where your advantages increase and theirs decrease. And it was somewhere during this intense period of conflict, during one of these battles or skirmishes as Roman and Kushite forces clashed repeatedly, our ancient sources don't give us the precise details of when or exactly how it happened, that Amanirenas suffered a serious, life-altering injury. She lost an eye in combat, either from an arrow, a spear, a sword stroke, or some other weapon. In the brutal, close-quarters fighting of ancient warfare, such injuries were common enough, though losing an eye was certainly a serious and traumatic wound. Think about what this meant in practical terms. In the ancient world, where medical care was primitive by modern standards, and where infection could easily kill you, even from wounds that today would be manageable, losing an eye could easily have been fatal. The fact that Amanirenas survived at all speaks to her physical toughness, to the skill of whatever healers treated her, and probably to sheer luck. Many people died from infected wounds that we would consider relatively minor today. That she lived through this injury and recovered enough to continue active military leadership is itself remarkable. But even more remarkably, losing an eye didn't stop her from continuing to lead her forces actively in the field. She didn't retire to the capital to convalesce while others commanded her armies. She didn't let this serious, painful, disfiguring injury end her active role in the resistance against Rome. Instead, she continued leading from the front, continued making strategic decisions, continued inspiring her warriors by her personal example of courage and determination. Think about what this means in terms of the ancient world's attitudes toward physical perfection and fitness to rule. In many ancient cultures, physical perfection, or at least physical wholeness, was strongly associated with fitness to rule. Kings and queens were supposed to be whole, unmarred, physically perfect representations of divine favor and rightful authority. A serious, highly visible injury like losing an eye could potentially undermine a leader's legitimacy, could be interpreted as a sign that the gods no longer favored them, could make people question whether they were still fit to rule. But that's not what happened with Amanirenas. Instead of undermining her authority, the missing eye actually seems to have enhanced it, to have made her even more fearsome and respected. It became part of her legend, part of what made her powerful and impressive. It was proof, visible, undeniable proof that she couldn't hide, that she'd been in the absolute thick of combat, that she'd literally shed blood defending Kush against Roman aggression, that she'd shared every danger her warriors faced, that she'd been wounded and kept fighting anyway. For her warriors, seeing their queen's scarred face, seeing the empty eye socket or whatever covering she might have worn, they knew with absolute certainty that she wasn't asking them to face any danger she wouldn't face herself. She'd proven beyond any doubt that she was a warrior as much as a ruler, that she shared their risks, that she was willing to sacrifice and suffer alongside them. That kind of leadership, that kind of personal example, creates bonds of loyalty that mere speeches or proclamations can never achieve. When a leader has literally been wounded in battle alongside their troops, it creates a connection that's incredibly powerful. For her enemies, the Roman soldiers who now knew they were fighting a one-eyed warrior queen who'd already been seriously wounded in battle and had kept fighting anyway, it was intimidating, even terrifying. They were facing someone who clearly would not back down, would not surrender, would not be broken by setbacks or wounds or defeats. The missing eye became a visual symbol of Kushite determination and absolute refusal to submit to Roman power. It said, "We'll fight until we can't fight anymore. We'll sacrifice whatever we must to preserve our independence. You cannot break our will." So, Amanirenas, one eye gone but her determination absolutely unshaken, continued leading the resistance. Now, Roman forces occupied the ruins of Napata, but they quickly discovered they had some very serious problems. Yes, they'd captured and destroyed the city. They'd inflicted what they thought would be a devastating blow to Kushite morale and capability. But Amanirenas hadn't surrendered or even sued for peace. Her army, though it had withdrawn and given up territory, was still intact, still organized, still clearly capable of continued fighting. And maintaining an occupation of Kushite territory was turning out to be vastly more difficult, more expensive, and more dangerous than conquering that territory had been. The desert environment that Kushites knew intimately was absolutely brutal for Roman soldiers, who were used to the relatively mild Mediterranean climate. The intense, scorching heat during the day was exhausting and dangerous, causing heat stroke and dehydration. The cold at night in the desert was harsh after the blazing days. Water was scarce, and finding reliable sources required local knowledge that Romans didn't have. The alien landscape was disorienting to soldiers from Italy or Greece or Gaul. The whole environment took a terrible toll on troop morale and health. Supply lines, stretching back hundreds of miles from Napata through increasingly hostile territory to Egypt, were long, vulnerable, and incredibly difficult and expensive to maintain. Every supply convoy bringing food, water, equipment, and reinforcements to the Roman forces in Kush had to be heavily guarded because Kushite forces kept launching raids and ambushes. Wagons were attacked, supplies were captured or destroyed. Soldiers escorting convoys were killed or wounded. Maintaining those supply lines required dedicating significant military forces just to convoy protection, forces that couldn't be used for actual offensive operations. And those Kushite forces weren't making life easy for the Roman occupiers. Amanirenas was implementing what we would today recognize as guerrilla warfare or insurgency tactics, though of course they didn't use those modern terms in the ancient world. Her forces would strike at Roman positions under cover of darkness, attacking sentries and patrols, creating fear and uncertainty. They'd attack supply caravans, seizing food and equipment that the Romans desperately needed. They'd harass Roman patrols with hit-and-run archery attacks, with Nubian archers shooting from long range and then fading away before Roman heavy infantry could close with them. They'd make it absolutely impossible for the Romans to hold territory securely, to pacify the region, to establish the kind of stable occupation that Rome needed if conquest was going to be profitable and sustainable. And then, critically, before Roman forces could organize a response in strength, before they could bring their superior numbers and heavy equipment to bear in a pitched battle where Roman advantages would dominate, the Kushites would simply melt away into the desert, disappearing into terrain they knew intimately, and Romans found completely alien and impenetrable. This kind of fluid, unpredictable hit-and-run warfare was absolutely not what Roman military doctrine was designed to handle, or what Roman forces excelled at. Roman military strength was built around set-piece battles, where disciplined formations of heavy infantry could engage enemy forces directly, around sieges of fortified cities, where Roman engineering and persistence could systematically break down defenses, around organized military campaigns with clear objectives and linear progression from one phase to the next. Romans were masters of that kind of conventional warfare, arguably the greatest masters in all of ancient history. But this constant, unpredictable harassment by mobile forces that refused to stand and fight, this warfare without clear front lines or decisive battles, this insurgency that made every day of occupation costly and dangerous, this played to every single Kushite advantage while minimizing every Roman advantage. Roman armor was less useful when you couldn't close with the enemy. Roman discipline and formation fighting was less relevant when the enemy wouldn't engage in formation combat. Roman siege equipment was useless when there were no fortified positions to attack. Roman engineering, logistics, all their sophisticated military systems, they were designed for different kinds of warfare than what Amanirenas was forcing them to fight. So the Romans were winning most of the individual tactical engagements when they could bring Kushite forces to battle. They were successfully occupying territory when they concentrated forces in particular areas. They were demonstrating military superiority in conventional terms. But they weren't winning the war. They weren't breaking Kushite resistance. They weren't achieving the kind of decisive victory that would let them impose peace terms and withdraw. They held Napata, they controlled some territory, but at what cost? At what ongoing expense? Roman soldiers were dying, not just in combat, but increasingly from disease, from heat exhaustion and other environmental factors, from the cumulative effects of campaigning in this harsh, unfamiliar environment against an enemy that wouldn't give them the conventional battles they were trained to fight. Resources and money were being poured into an occupation that showed absolutely no sign of becoming stable or profitable. Every week, every month, the war dragged on. The cost-benefit analysis looked worse and worse for Rome. And back in Rome itself, Augustus had plenty of other concerns demanding his attention and resources beyond this increasingly frustrating and expensive war in southern Egypt and Kush. His empire stretched from Britain in the west to Mesopotamia in the east, from the Rhine and Danube rivers in the north to the deserts of North Africa in the south. There were multiple frontiers requiring attention, resources, and military forces. The Germanic frontier along the Rhine was always tense and occasionally exploded into serious warfare that threatened Roman territory. The eastern frontier with the Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival, required constant diplomatic and military attention. Internal political challenges within Rome and Italy required the emperor's focus and management. Egypt was valuable to Rome, certainly, incredibly valuable in fact. The grain that fed the city of Rome itself, the wheat that kept the urban population from rioting, came largely from the fields of Egypt. That grain supply was so crucial that Augustus had made Egypt his personal province, rather than a senatorial province, keeping direct control of it. But Kush? For all its gold and trade, it didn't have that same kind of critical strategic importance that would justify an unlimited commitment of Roman resources and attention. It wasn't worth bankrupting the empire or neglecting other frontiers to completely conquer and hold. Meanwhile, Amanirenas understood her strategic position perfectly. She'd grasped something fundamental about asymmetric warfare, about conflicts between a large, powerful empire and a smaller but determined kingdom. She didn't need to utterly defeat Rome militarily in the field. That probably wasn't even possible, given Rome's vast resources, its ability to raise new armies, its determination to never accept defeat. What she needed to do was make continued warfare too costly and frustrating for Rome to sustain, make the occupation too expensive and difficult, make Rome decide that the game simply wasn't worth the candle. She needed to prove that Kush couldn't be easily conquered and pacified, that any Roman occupation would be expensive, difficult, dangerous, and potentially endless, that the costs of trying to hold Kushite territory would always outweigh the benefits of controlling it. She needed to make Rome conclude that a negotiated peace, preserving Kushite independence, was preferable to continued costly warfare with no clear end in sight. And her strategy was working brilliantly. The longer the conflict dragged on without any clear, decisive Roman victory, without any sign of Kushite submission or collapse, without any indication that the occupation was becoming stable or profitable, the more apparent it became to Roman commanders and officials that this wasn't going to be another relatively easy conquest like so many others had been. Rome was facing an enemy that wouldn't break, wouldn't submit, wouldn't conveniently collapse at the first show of overwhelming force. Then came one of the most important and symbolically significant military engagements of the entire war, the defense of the fortress at Qasr Ibrim. This fortress, which still exists as an archaeological site today, was dramatically perched on a cliff high above the Nile River, commanding a vital stretch of the river and the surrounding territory. It was a naturally strong defensive position, made even stronger by Kushite fortifications. It controlled river traffic, dominated the local area, and represented a key strategic point that neither side could afford to lose. Roman forces, determined to capture this crucial strong point and hopefully break Kushite resistance once and for all, laid formal siege to Qasr Ibrim. They brought all their considerable expertise in siege warfare to bear. And remember, these were troops who'd successfully besieged and captured countless fortified cities across 3 continents. They knew every trick for breaking defensive positions, building siege towers to overtop walls, using battering rams to break gates, undermining walls, building siege mounds, cutting off supplies to starve defenders out. They had experience, they had equipment, they had determination, and they had numerical superiority. But the Kushite defenders of Qasr Ibrim, fighting on terrain that heavily favored defense, inspired by Amanirenas' example of courage and determination, fighting literally for their homeland and their freedom, absolutely refused to break or surrender. Day after grinding day, week after exhausting week, month after frustrating month, the siege continued. Romans would attack, pressing forward with shields locked and swords ready, and defenders would repel them with arrows, spears, rocks, boiling oil, whatever they had. Romans would try to undermine the walls, and defenders would counter-tunnel and collapse the Roman tunnels. Romans would attempt to starve the garrison out, but defenders held firm on short rations. Neither side could achieve a decisive advantage in this grinding siege, and it turned into exactly the kind of costly, frustrating stalemate that Rome couldn't afford to sustain indefinitely. Every day the siege continued cost Roman lives, consumed resources, tied down forces that could have been used elsewhere, and demonstrated to everyone watching that Kush could match Rome's legendary siege warfare capabilities, at least on favorable defensive terrain. This stalemate at Qasr Ibrim was actually far more strategically and politically significant than it might seem at first glance. For Rome, failing to quickly capture a single fortress, being held at bay by defenders they'd expected to overwhelm with their superior numbers and siege expertise, this was embarrassing in ways that went beyond mere military frustration. It was a clear, undeniable signal that Kush was a much more formidable opponent than Roman planners and commanders had anticipated, that this wasn't some minor kingdom that would collapse at the first show of serious force. More fundamentally, it demonstrated that Rome couldn't simply impose its will on Kush through military might alone. The assumption that had guided Roman policy, that Kush would quickly submit when confronted with Roman power, had been proven completely wrong. Kush had the military capability, the determination, the strategic intelligence, and the favorable geographic position to resist effectively and indefinitely. Every day that Qasr Ibrim held out proved this reality more clearly. For Kush, successfully defending Qasr Ibrim against everything Rome could throw at them demonstrated something absolutely crucial to both their own people and to Rome. They could hold their ground against the world's most powerful military force. They weren't going to be swept aside or easily conquered. They had the capability, the courage, and the strategic position to defend their independence effectively. Every day that fortress held out was another day proving that Rome couldn't simply walk through Kush the way they'd walked through so many other kingdoms. Eventually, after this grinding, frustrating, expensive siege had dragged on far longer than anyone had initially expected, after it had become painfully clear that this conflict wasn't going to end with a quick, decisive Roman victory, something remarkable happened. Something that would have seemed almost unthinkable at the war's beginning, something that violated Roman assumptions about how they dealt with barbarian kingdoms. Roman commanders, looking at the strategic situation with realistic eyes rather than through the lens of wounded pride or imperial ideology, recognizing that this conflict was achieving absolutely nothing except draining Roman resources and costing Roman lives with no clear end in sight,
made a proposal that shocked many observers both at the time and since. They asked for negotiations. They proposed a diplomatic solution to the conflict rather than
continuing to pursue total military victory. Let that sink in for a moment, because it's genuinely remarkable. Rome, the empire that usually dictated harsh terms to defeated enemies, that typically demanded complete submission and heavy tribute from conquered peoples, that prided itself on never backing down or accepting anything less than total victory, was asking for negotiations with Kush. Not demanding surrender, not insisting on submission, not imposing conditions from a position of overwhelming victory, but actually proposing to negotiate as one sovereign power to another sovereign power. This was an implicit admission of several crucial realities. It was acknowledging that Rome couldn't simply crush Kushite resistance through military force alone, at least not at any acceptable cost. It was recognizing that Kush had proven itself a formidable opponent worthy of diplomatic engagement rather than just military subjugation. It was accepting that sometimes the smart play isn't pursuing total victory at enormous cost, but rather accepting a negotiated compromise that serves your interests adequately. But Amanirenas, demonstrating once again the diplomatic acumen and strategic intelligence that matched her military courage, had her own conditions for these negotiations. She made it absolutely clear through her representatives that she would not waste her time negotiating with some middling Roman general or provincial governor who lacked real authority to make binding decisions. She would not engage in discussions with officials who might make promises that Rome could later disavow or ignore. If Rome genuinely wanted peace, if they were serious about ending this conflict through diplomacy rather than continued warfare, they would need to send representatives with actual authority to negotiate and make commitments. Ideally, representatives who spoke directly for Emperor Augustus himself, or, at absolute minimum, officials of sufficient rank and authority that their word would be binding on Rome. She was insisting on high-level, serious diplomatic engagement, not some pro forma negotiations with minor officials. This was bold to the point of audacity. She was essentially insisting that Rome treat Kush as an equal sovereign power, worthy of imperial-level diplomatic engagement, not as some minor barbarian kingdom that could be dealt with by local officials. She was demanding that Rome acknowledge, at least implicitly through the level of diplomatic engagement, that they couldn't simply impose their will on Kush, that Kushite sovereignty and independence were real and had to be respected. For a kingdom that Rome had initially viewed as a minor southern power that would quickly submit to demands for tribute, this was a remarkable reversal. Amanirenas had fought so effectively, had made Roman occupation so costly and difficult, had proven Kushite military capabilities so convincingly, that Rome was now willing to engage in serious, high-level diplomacy, rather than simply demanding submission. This alone was a major victory, a vindication of her entire strategy of making conquest and occupation too expensive for Rome to sustain. And remarkably, showing both Roman pragmatism and grudging respect for what Kushite military capabilities had forced them to acknowledge, Augustus agreed to Amanirenas' terms. He sent word that Kushite ambassadors would be formally received at the highest levels of Roman diplomacy. The negotiations would take place on the Greek island of Samos, where Augustus himself was currently residing, and they would be serious, substantive discussions about ending the conflict, not some pro forma charade. This was Rome, essentially acknowledging, through its willingness to engage in this level of diplomatic process, that Kush had earned the right to negotiate as a sovereign equal, rather than simply submit as a defeated enemy. It was an implicit recognition that the military campaign hadn't achieved its objectives, that Kush couldn't be easily conquered or subdued, that a negotiated peace was preferable to continued expensive and frustrating warfare. So Kushite envoys, carefully selected representatives speaking for Amanirenas and the Kingdom of Kush, began the extraordinarily long and challenging journey from their capital at Meroe, in the heart of Kush, to the island of Samos in the Aegean Sea. They traveled north through Kushite territory, probably up the Nile, then through Roman-controlled Egypt, presumably under some kind of safe conduct guarantee that protected them from arrest or harm. They crossed the Mediterranean Sea, probably by ship from Alexandria, and sailed to Samos. This journey itself, which would have taken weeks or possibly months, depending on weather and travel conditions, was tremendously significant in multiple ways. It demonstrated Kush's sophistication as a state, their capability to conduct high-level international diplomacy, to send representatives who could negotiate effectively with the world's most powerful empire. It showed that Kush had experienced diplomats, people who understood protocol and negotiation, who could represent their kingdom's interests at the highest levels of ancient Mediterranean diplomacy. It also showed Kushite confidence and determination. They were willing to send envoys deep into Roman-controlled territory, to travel thousands of miles to negotiate directly with Augustus, to insist on diplomatic engagement at the highest level. This wasn't the behavior of a defeated kingdom desperate for any peace terms Rome might offer. This was the behavior of a sovereign power negotiating from a position of demonstrated military capability and unshaken resolve. There's a wonderful story, which appears in some ancient sources and may be somewhat embellished or legendary, but which captures the spirit and drama of these negotiations perfectly, about what the Kushite ambassadors brought with them as a diplomatic gift for Augustus. According to these accounts, they presented the emperor with a bundle of golden arrows, beautiful objects, valuable in themselves, but carrying a powerful symbolic message. And they delivered a message, either verbally or through interpreters, that was simultaneously diplomatic and unmistakably threatening, that offered peace, but also warned of continued war. The message allegedly went something like this: "Great Augustus, mighty Emperor of Rome, if you seek friendship and peaceful relations with the Kingdom of Kush, then accept these golden arrows as tokens of our sincere goodwill and our desire for peace between our two great kingdoms." But then came the second part, the implicit threat wrapped in diplomatic language. However, if you desire to continue this war, if you insist on trying to conquer and subjugate Kush, then you will need many such arrows, because we will fight you to the absolute bitter end. We will never surrender our independence. We will never submit to foreign domination. We will make every inch of Kushite territory cost you dearly. We would prefer peace, but we are fully prepared for continued war, if that's what you choose. Whether these were the literal words spoken, ancient sources aren't always entirely reliable about such details, or whether later historians embellished the account with dramatic dialogue that captured the essence, if not the exact words, the message captures perfectly the position that Kush was negotiating from. They weren't coming to Samos as defeated supplicants begging for mercy, as conquered people hoping Rome might show clemency. They were coming as representatives of a kingdom that had proven it could fight, that had successfully resisted Roman military power, that had made Roman occupation prohibitively expensive and difficult. They were offering peace, genuine, lasting peace that could benefit both sides, but they were offering it from a position of demonstrated strength and absolutely unshakable resolve. They were saying, "We can end this conflict on terms that work for both of us, or we can continue fighting indefinitely. But either way, we will never simply submit to Roman domination." This was sophisticated diplomacy of the highest order, combining the olive branch of peace with the implicit threat of continued costly war. The negotiations that followed, which probably took place over multiple days or even weeks of intense discussions, resulted in the Treaty of Samos, an agreement that was absolutely extraordinary and even shocking by the normal standards of Roman diplomacy and imperial practice. You have to understand the typical pattern of how Rome dealt with defeated or threatening kingdoms to appreciate just how unusual and favorable this treaty was for Kush. Typically, when Rome made peace with a kingdom or people that had challenged Roman power or resisted Roman expansion, the terms were harsh and one-sided, designed to demonstrate Roman superiority and extract maximum benefit from the defeated party. Standard Roman peace terms usually included significant loss of territory, with the defeated kingdom giving up border regions or strategic areas to Roman control. Heavy tribute payments in gold, silver, grain, or other valuable goods, often crushing burdens that impoverished the subjected people. Mandatory provision of military forces to serve as auxiliaries in Roman armies, essentially mercenary troops forced to fight for Rome. Surrender of hostages, often the children of rulers, held in Rome to ensure compliance with treaty terms. Acknowledgement of Roman superiority and acceptance of Rome's right to interfere in internal affairs. These harsh terms served multiple purposes for Rome. They extracted wealth and resources to enrich Rome. They weakened potential threats and made future resistance less likely. They demonstrated to everyone watching that challenging Rome led to harsh consequences. They satisfied Roman pride and the expectation that Rome always won and always imposed its will on others. Dozens of kingdoms and peoples across 3 continents had been forced to accept such terms. But the Treaty of Samos with Kush was remarkably different from this standard pattern. The terms were almost unprecedented in their restraint and in how favorable they were to Kush. First, Rome agreed to withdraw completely from all the Kushite territories they'd occupied during the war. They'd pull their forces back north of the border, essentially to the same frontier that had existed before the conflict began. There would be no permanent Roman occupation of Kushite lands, no Roman garrisons stationed in Kush, no ongoing Roman military presence south of the agreed border. This alone was remarkable. Rome was giving up territory they'd conquered, withdrawing from positions they'd fought to take, essentially returning to the status quo ante bellum, without gaining any territory from the conflict. But even more remarkable, even more unprecedented and shocking to observers familiar with Roman diplomatic practice, was this crucial term. Kush would not have to pay tribute to Rome. Not a single coin, not a token payment, not even a symbolic acknowledgement of Roman superiority through some minor annual gift. The Kingdom of Kush would maintain its complete, total, absolute independence and sovereignty. They would not be a Roman client state, not a tributary kingdom, not in any way subordinate to or dependent on Roman authority. They would be a fully independent sovereign power, with complete freedom to govern themselves, conduct their own foreign policy, maintain their own military, collect their own taxes, and make their own decisions without Roman interference or oversight. For an empire that demanded tribute from dozens of client states and subordinate kingdoms across its territories, that built a significant portion of its economy on systematic extraction of wealth from conquered peoples, that typically insisted on at least nominal acknowledgement of Roman superiority, even from kingdoms they couldn't fully conquer. This was absolutely unprecedented. Rome was essentially recognizing Kush as a fully independent, sovereign, equal power, not attempting to extract any ongoing benefits from them, not imposing any terms that suggested Roman superiority or Kushite subordination. Why did Rome agree to such remarkably favorable terms for Kush? Why did they accept what was essentially a status quo peace that gave them nothing tangible except an end to the fighting? No tribute, no territory, no ongoing benefits. Several crucial factors came together to produce this unusual outcome, and understanding them helps us appreciate what Amanirenas actually achieved through her strategic brilliance. First, and most obviously, Amanirenas had successfully made continued warfare far too costly for Rome to sustain. The military expenses of maintaining forces in hostile territory, far from Roman population centers, the constant drain on resources to supply armies operating in desert conditions, the steady casualties from combat, disease, and environmental factors, the difficulty of maintaining supply lines through increasingly hostile territory. All of this added up to an absolutely terrible cost-benefit ratio for Rome. Every month the war continued was gold and Roman lives poured into a conflict that showed no signs of ending favorably. Second, and this is crucial to understand, Rome genuinely had much bigger concerns and more important priorities elsewhere in their vast empire. Augustus was managing territories stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Germanic frontier to North Africa. The Germanic frontier along the Rhine River was always potentially explosive and periodically did erupt into serious warfare that threatened Roman territory. The eastern frontier with the Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival and only peer competitor, required constant diplomatic and military attention to prevent renewed conflict. Internal political challenges within Rome itself, managing the transition from republic to empire, maintaining political stability and support among the senatorial class and the urban population. All of this demanded Augustus's attention and political skill. Egypt's value to Rome was primarily agricultural, the massive grain shipments that fed the city of Rome itself, keeping the urban population from rioting, came from Egyptian fields. That grain supply was absolutely crucial to political stability in Rome, which is why Augustus had made Egypt his personal province. But Kush? For all its gold mines and trade, it didn't have that same kind of critical strategic importance that would justify an unlimited, indefinite commitment of Roman military resources and imperial attention. The gold was valuable, certainly, but not worth bankrupting the empire or fatally weakening other frontiers to completely conquer and permanently occupy Kush against determined resistance. Third, and perhaps most important in terms of the specific diplomatic outcome, Rome had genuinely come to respect and even fear Kushite military capabilities through hard, painful, expensive experience. Roman commanders and soldiers who'd fought in this campaign weren't operating on assumptions and prejudices anymore. They'd encountered Kushite forces in battle. They'd experienced the frustration of trying to occupy hostile territory against guerrilla resistance. They'd seen the siege of Qasr Ibrim drag on inconclusively. They'd watched their supply convoys get attacked repeatedly. They understood, in a way that Romans sitting comfortably in Italy might not, that Kush was a serious military power that commanded genuine respect. This wasn't some weak kingdom that was going to collapse easily or accept subjugation tamely. Amanirenas had proven beyond any doubt that Kush could fight effectively, could resist tenaciously, could make Roman occupation difficult, expensive, dangerous, and potentially endless. Roman commanders now understood that achieving total military conquest of Kush would require a commitment of resources and time that simply wasn't worthwhile given Rome's other priorities. Rome's famous pragmatism, their ability to be flexible and adapt to circumstances rather than rigidly pursuing impossible goals or letting pride override strategic calculation, led them to accept peace on terms that preserved Kushite independence. They recognized that sometimes the smart strategic play is to accept a reasonable compromise that ends costly conflict, rather than pursuing total victory at enormous expense. They understood that not every border needed to be pushed forward, that not every neighboring kingdom needed to be conquered, that sometimes peaceful relations with an independent but respectful neighbor served Roman interests better than expensive occupation of hostile territory. The Treaty of Samos was formally signed around 21 or 20 BCE, bringing official, recognized peace between the mighty Roman Empire and the independent Kingdom of Kush, after several years of grinding, costly warfare that had surprised everyone with its intensity and inconclusiveness. Both sides agreed to respect the negotiated border, to refrain from hostile actions, to maintain peaceful relations. Trade would be permitted and even encouraged across the frontier. Diplomatic contact could continue when needed. But Amanirenas, that brilliant strategist who understood psychological warfare and symbolic politics, as well as military tactics and diplomatic negotiation, had one final dramatic move planned, one last powerful message to send about Kushite independence, dignity, and permanent defiance of any claims of Roman superiority. Remember that bronze head of Emperor Augustus that her forces had captured way back at the beginning of the war, during the initial Kushite offensive, when they'd overwhelmed Roman positions at Syene and Elephantine? She'd kept that bronze head carefully throughout the entire war. Through all the fighting, all the strategic withdrawals, all the negotiations, she'd made sure that particular trophy was preserved and protected. And now, with peace achieved on favorable terms, she still didn't return it to Rome as a gesture of goodwill or reconciliation. She didn't offer it back as part of the diplomatic niceties that often accompanied peace treaties. Instead, she took it back to Meroe, her capital city, and ordered something that was symbolically brilliant, politically powerful, and deeply meaningful. She had the bronze head of Augustus buried beneath the entrance steps of a major temple in Meroe, one of the important religious and civic buildings in the capital. Not hidden away in some vault where no one would see it, not destroyed or melted down for the bronze, but deliberately, carefully buried under the steps where people would walk every single day, where every person entering that temple would literally walk over it, trample upon it, grind it beneath their feet. Think about the layers of symbolism in this act. Every person who entered that temple, priests conducting religious ceremonies, officials conducting civic business, ordinary citizens coming to worship or participate in community gatherings, every single one of them would literally be walking over, trampling upon, grinding into the dirt the bronze head representing the mighty Roman emperor, the most powerful man in the world, the ruler who claimed dominion over the Mediterranean and beyond. Every day, as long as that temple stood and people used it, hundreds or thousands of feet would pass over Augustus's face. The emperor who demanded tribute, who expected submission, who insisted on acknowledgement of Roman superiority. His image would be permanently beneath Kushite feet, symbolically subjugated in the most visceral, daily, physical way possible. To Kushite audiences, the message was crystal clear and tremendously powerful. Look what we have done. We stood up to the most powerful empire the world has ever known. We fought them to a standstill. We forced them to negotiate with us as equals. We forced them to recognize our sovereignty and independence. We made them withdraw without tribute, without ongoing control, without any acknowledgement of superiority. And we're keeping a piece of their emperor himself as permanent proof of our victory, as daily reminder that we defied Rome successfully and preserved our freedom. It reinforced Amanirenas' legitimacy and enhanced her reputation as a leader who delivered on her promise to defend Kushite independence. It demonstrated the success of her resistance strategy in the most tangible, visible way possible. It became a daily ritual of symbolic assertion of independence, performed unconsciously by every person who climbed those temple steps. It was propaganda of the highest, most sophisticated order. Not lies or deception, but powerful symbolic communication of genuine historical achievements that would be reinforced daily for as long as the temple stood. And here's what makes this story even more incredible and validates that it's not just legend. In 1910, that's less than 120 years ago, British archaeologists excavating the ancient ruins of Meroe in Sudan actually found that bronze head, buried exactly where ancient sources had described, right under the entrance steps of a temple, exactly as tradition said. After spending nearly 2,000 years being trampled by countless feet, walked over by generations of Kushites, it was finally excavated and brought to light. Today, it's one of the prize exhibits at the British Museum in London. It's one of the finest bronze portrait sculptures of Augustus that survives from the ancient world. Beautifully crafted, with remarkable attention to facial detail, remarkably well preserved despite its long burial and the feet that trampled it for centuries. When you see it in the museum today, when you look at that bronze face with its carefully rendered features, you're looking at an object that was actually part of this incredible historical drama that was carried from Roman Egypt to Kush by Amanirenas' warriors, that spent 2 millennia being walked over in a Kushite temple as a symbol of successful resistance to imperial power. The peace that Amanirenas negotiated through her remarkable combination of military resistance, strategic intelligence, and diplomatic skill held for an absolutely astonishing length of time, over 300 years. 3 full centuries of peace between Rome and Kush. To put that in perspective for modern readers, that's considerably longer than the United States has existed as a nation. The border between Roman Egypt and independent Kush remained stable, peaceful, and mutually respected from around 20 BCE until well into the 3rd century CE. This wasn't just a temporary ceasefire or a brief breathing space before renewed hostilities. This wasn't Rome biding its time and building strength before trying again to conquer Kush. This was genuine, lasting, enduring peace between 2 major powers who'd fought each other to a costly stalemate and then crafted a diplomatic framework that served both parties' interests over the very, very long term. That 3-century duration proves that the treaty wasn't just militarily necessary, but actually strategically sound, that it created stable arrangements both sides could live with comfortably. During these 3 centuries of peace, the relationship between Rome and Kush actually evolved into something much more positive and mutually beneficial than just avoiding war. Trade flourished across the border. Roman manufactured goods, wine, olive oil, and other Mediterranean products flowing south into Kush. Kushite gold, ivory, exotic African goods flowing north into Roman Egypt and beyond into the Mediterranean world. Both sides benefited economically from this peaceful commerce. There's clear archaeological evidence of cultural exchanges happening in both directions. Artistic styles and motifs show mutual influences. There are finds of Roman coins in Kushite territory and Kushite goods in Roman Egypt. Diplomatic contacts continued at various levels when needed to resolve any border issues or maintain good relations. Rome and Kush weren't close allies or anything like that. They remained separate, independent powers with their own interests. But they were respectful neighbors who'd learned through hard, painful, expensive experience that peaceful coexistence served both parties much better than conflict. This 3-century peace is actually one of the most impressive aspects of Amanirenas' entire legacy when you really think about it deeply. She didn't just win some battles or force Rome to temporarily back off. She didn't achieve just a short-term victory that collapsed after she died and could no longer maintain it through force of personality. Instead, she established a lasting framework for peaceful international relations that worked, that endured, that served her people's interests for literally centuries after her death. That's sophisticated statecraft and far-sighted diplomacy of the absolute highest order. For Kush, this long peace meant they could continue developing their distinctive civilization without Roman interference, pressure, or cultural domination. The kingdom remained completely independent and distinctly, proudly Kushite in its culture, identity, and political system. They continued their tradition of building those magnificent steep-sided pyramids. Over 200 of them still stand today in the Sudanese desert. They continued their far-reaching trade networks that connected sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean world and beyond. They continued practicing their religion with its unique blend of influences. They continued writing in their distinctive Meroitic script, maintaining their political system with its remarkable tradition of powerful Kandakes who could wield supreme authority. The peace Amanirenas won preserved all of this. Without her successful military resistance, without the favorable treaties she negotiated through that resistance, Kush might well have been gradually absorbed into the Roman Empire, the way so many other kingdoms were. It might have lost its distinctive cultural identity through the slow process of Romanization that transformed so many conquered regions, where Roman language, Roman culture, Roman political systems gradually displaced local traditions. Instead, Kushite civilization continued flourishing on its own terms, maintaining its independence and distinctiveness for centuries. For Rome, meanwhile, the peace meant they had a stable, secure southern border for their incredibly valuable Egyptian province, without the enormous expense and constant military commitment that trying to occupy and control hostile Kush territory would have required. They could conduct profitable trade with Kush, rather than fighting an expensive, endless guerrilla war in hostile desert territory, far from Roman population centers. They could focus their military resources and political attention on frontiers and threats that seemed more pressing or more important. The Germanic tribes across the Rhine, the Parthian Empire in the east, maintaining internal political stability. Thank you for joining me tonight on Histocrat at Night. Amanirenas' story is one of courage and wisdom, of knowing when to fight and when to negotiate, of defending freedom against overwhelming power. She made Rome retreat, something few could claim. Her peace lasted 3 centuries, proof that what she achieved mattered profoundly. She stands eternal in history as testament to courage, intelligence, and the refusal to be conquered. Until next time, remember that determined, brilliant leadership can change history's course, that freedom is always worth defending, and that even the mightiest empires have limits. Sleep well.